Hi. So this question about how best to give is something that I've thought about a lot, and the organization that I founded and that I'm the president of, Giving What We Can, has been set up to really address. And this is something that we've spent literally thousands of hours trying to answer, and that's sadly still not enough time to answer it in its fullest detail, but it is enough time to make some inroads and to be able to share quite a bit of what we've found. I'm also a research fellow in philosophy at the University of Oxford. So I originally became interested in charity when I would have discussions as an undergraduate with my friends, and these discussions would go into the night as they do, and I was quite idealistic, and my friends would end up saying, well, if you think that, why don't you give all your money to help people starving in Africa, or some other cliche like that. And this was obviously designed just to stop my line of conversation, but it was something that I started to think about a bit more seriously as to, actually, why shouldn't I do that? Why, if people are created equal, and people in Africa or Asia or anywhere else are just as valuable as me and my family, then maybe I should spend quite a bit of my money in order to try to help people and to help them as much as possible. So I started to think about what's the most I could achieve if I really wanted to help improve the lives of as many people as I could. And I started to think about that and to divide up the different possibilities, as I have here, into what I could do with my voluntary work, what I could do with my career, what I could do through my personal relationships, and what I could do through donation. And as I thought about it more and started doing some research, I realized that one can achieve a very large amount through donation, even in my case, of just on an academic salary. It's possible to achieve a great deal, and it's not clear actually that I can beat that with these other categories. So I want to focus on this. So I worked out that I would earn about £1.5 million over my life, and that if I really wanted to give away as much of that as possible, that I would be able to keep about £500,000 and still have the kind of quality of life that I had as a grad student. And this was actually pretty good. I have a wonderful wife, then my fiancée, and access to all of the best literature and poetry that the world has produced over thousands of years, as we all do, and the same with music and other things, and could walk around in beautiful places and talk to great friends and have conversations into the evening, all the things that really were important to me. And so there was this possibility that I could have all of that, but still actually be able to donate about £1 million. And so by putting it into those terms, it made me think more seriously about it. Instead of donating in dribs and drabs, once I saw it as this large amount, it really made it clear that it was worth putting in some time to work out how best to donate that. And as I say, there are many ways that one could use this to help people. I'm going to focus, in this case, on health and the health of people in poor countries in particular, as that's somewhere where I think it can be, there is the best evidence as to extremely effective charity. So a big question here, and this is really what I'm going to focus my talk on, is what metric or what way of measuring this? How should we think about the impact that one can have, and how can we compare different things? And there's something which is often talked about in this context, which is the percentage spent on overheads or administration. So they'll say that a particular organization spends only 10% of its money on administration and 90% on program costs, for example. I think that that's an interesting statistic, but ultimately it's not very valuable for making these choices. And there are multiple reasons for this. One of them is that the administration costs can actually be very important to running a charity very effectively. It could be that they should be spending more on administration than they are, and they should be better administered. But another reason is that what matters more than that is what they're actually spending that 90% or 80% or whatever on. What is it that they're actually doing? And here is, I think, the key question, which is, for a given donation, so suppose you're thinking of donating £10,000 or £100,000 to a particular organization, what will they do with that? What's going to come out of that? So what difference will there be, and how much benefit will people receive? And there is a lot of research on this, and a lot of academic research. I've talked extensively about this. I'm advising the World Health Organization on the ethics of global health. And it's something where a lot of that information, though, is in very academic language and so on, and needs to be kind of brought through to be explained as to how one can actually produce these benefits. I'll try to do a bit of that, although it might still be a bit academic, in which case I apologize in advance. So here's a simple example, though, to start off with. So it costs about $40,000 to provide a guide dog to someone. This is one way that we can try to combat blindness in a developed country. In contrast, it costs about $20 to completely cure someone of blindness caused by trachoma, and a similar amount actually for cataract blindness. So this is an interesting statistic because it means that for a given donation, let's say a $40,000 donation, that could either provide one guide dog to someone who's blind and help them get through their life, but they would still be blind, but they would have less disadvantage from that. Or you could completely cure 2,000 people of blindness. So this is an example of the kind of disparities you can get in terms of impact. It would seem to me to be better to be completely cured of blindness than to just have a guide dog, and then better to help thousands of people rather than just a single person. So there are often these very large disparities. But we can take this idea potentially further. In this case, I use blindness, but we want to compare more broadly, not just people suffering from exactly the same condition. I'm going to try to make it broad enough that it can cover everything to do with health. That's still not broad enough to make all the choices that you'd want to make, but hopefully I can illustrate some of these things. So one question you could ask is how many lives can you save? But this has a major problem with it, which in public health they say no one's ever saved a life. Because if you treat someone, say, for their heart attack and you get them to live through it, then lo and behold, 20 years later, they die of something. So what we really care about is extending lives. And it really matters whether we extend them by one day, so we just, or whether we extend them by many years. So you could change it to a question about how many life years can we save, and that would be a much better question. But it still has this problem that there's still questions about the quality of that life. For example, in some cases, someone might be diagnosed with a form of cancer and have to choose whether to have a very intensive, invasive therapy, which would mean they'd have longer to live, but the quality would be lower. And so people make these trade-offs between the quality and the quantity of life. And there are also many cases where we have some kind of therapy which takes someone, it doesn't extend their life at all, but it improves it. For example, if the case of curing someone's blindness. So we want to be able to include those things too. And so the question that is normally asked in public health here in the UK and also in global health is how many life years adjusted for their quality can we save, or quality adjusted life years. And they often call these QALYs. So I'm going to talk about this concept a bit, but you can think of it as a year of healthy life, is the rough and ready way to think about it. Let's see if we can get the next slide. Okay, so here's a rough schematic as to what's going on here. So the idea is this is a life, and we're thinking about the quality of this person's life over time. And it has its ups and downs. As their health gets worse, they get sick, and then they recover, and so on. Eventually they die, in this case at about 75. And the idea is we want to think about how many years of life do they have, and how high quality was it. And we want to think about the area under this graph is what's going on there. And so a simple kind of example is the two different ways you can improve someone's life in this case. The first is by improving the quality of their life during that period, and the second is by extending their life. And that you measure how these things compare by the area of these things. And they calibrate all of these things mathematically through a whole lot of survey questions and things, which I won't bore you with, but there are answers to all of this. And it's not really meant to be a precise measure, it's meant to be a rough and ready measure, but that will be enough to actually make some really interesting progress. And the real benefit of them is they allow us to compare apples and oranges, at least within health, to compare different types of ways of improving people's health. Now, one can ask, what is a QALY worth? What is one of these quality-adjusted life years worth? The NHS uses this measure, and they say that they're prepared to fund a new drug if it costs less than £20,000 for each of these life years that it produces. Now, there are 8,760 hours in a year, so this comes to about £2.30 per hour. So I think that's a pretty good deal for an hour of healthy life. If you compare going to the cinema or something for an hour, I think it's better to have an entire additional hour of healthy life than to just upgrade an hour to a cinema hour. I think that a year of healthy life is worth at least this much, and I think most people would agree with that. And they'd be prepared to spend more than that for their own health. However, can we get a QALY for less than that if we donate to different organizations? What I'm going to look at here very quickly is curing or preventing HIV. So here are a couple of different ways of approaching this. The first is a surgical treatment for an AIDS-defining illness called Kaposi sarcoma, and the second is antiretroviral therapy. And these bars just represent how many of these years of healthy life can we achieve for £1,000 of donation. And you can see there's a very large discrepancy there. Also, I've included a barrier here, which is how effective it needs to be in order to be funded by the NHS. And you can see that even the first one actually is effective enough to be funded by the NHS, but the second one is vastly more effective than it needs to be. But it doesn't stop here. We can zoom out quite a long way and then compare prevention of transmission during pregnancy. The idea is to give drugs to the mother so that the child won't have HIV. And that's a very targeted intervention, preventative, and is much more cost effective again. If we zoom out further, we can compare this with distribution of condoms to prevent HIV spread, is much more effective again because it's so cheap. And then if we zoom out even more, and then this isn't within HIV, but this is an example of something that one of the most effective organizations we know of does, is distributing bed nets to help prevent malaria. And that's much more effective again. And so at least in the domain of charities working in global health, you get this kind of a distribution of effectiveness, where some things are vastly more effective than other things. And it's really worth bearing this in mind. In fact, here are a couple of facts about this. Health programs in developing countries can be a very good deal, and they can be 1,000 times more effective than spending marginal money on health is in the UK, because we've already got all of the easy wins here, but in many countries they don't yet. And 1,000 times more than is needed to be a good deal. So what I mean by this is they produce, for every £20,000, instead of producing just 1 year of life, they produce 1,000 years of healthy life. So they're 1,000 times more effective than those numbers we previously said were already a good deal. And also that our money's worth more than we might have thought, because in your wallets you'll each have more than enough to produce a year of healthy life to people living in poorer countries. But this is only if it's used on the best programs. It really matters which of those bars you're funding. And where to give ends up being incredibly important. Now, normally these facts are just thought of by policymakers, but they're important for everyone when it comes to donating money. And so I like to think, at least in my case, when I donate money, I'm trying to help people, and I'm trying to help them as much as possible. If there were two different options and someone said one of them helped people more, I would definitely choose that one, and I would go to quite a lot of lengths to do so. And so if I wanted to donate money to help fight AIDS, it really matters to me where I'm giving that money, as to whether I would be donating to an organization that's treating Kaposi sarcoma or an organization that is funding condom distribution, for example, which was 100 times more effective. And also, in that case, I might wonder why I was restricting things to HIV and AIDS in the first place. Why, if I'm trying to help people, why only help people from one particular illness? If there's some way I can help 10 times as many people, or help the same number of people by 10 times as much by switching to malaria, I don't really care what disease is causing this trouble, so long as I can stop it. So that's another kind of thought that I think this provokes. Thank you. As I said here, the differences are not something of 10% or 50% of effectiveness, but up to 100,000% more effective, and getting 100,000% more return for your money if you choose really wisely here. And if you pick two at random from this list of interventions we studied with more than 100, on average, the more effective is 100 times more effective than the less effective of those two. And so this, where you give can be even more important than if you give at all. And so I consider this for myself as to whether to spend £1.5 million on myself or to spend £500,000 on myself and donate £1 million. And I thought I would do the second of these. I'd still have a great life, save at least 30,000 years of life, and I'm sure that you can do much more than this. But I've decided I wanted to go a bit further and not just think about what I was going to do, but to try to support other people in making a similar choice. So I set up an organization called Giving What We Can. And this is a community of people who feel strongly about poverty and really want to help people in need. And each member makes a pledge to donate at least 10% of their income until they retire to whichever organization they think can most effectively use it to help people in poverty. And they don't give the money through us, they just donate directly to wherever they think is effective. And they can ignore our advice if they want to. And we'd also advise them and advise others on where you can give most effectively and save people the thousands of hours of research time on this and instead just share our results and our reasoning. And there are two different aims we have. One of these aims is to get people to give more, and the other is to get people to give more effectively. And if you combine those together, then you can increase people's impact by more than a factor of 100 in a typical case. As we heard, we have more than 300 members at the moment and more than $100 million pledged. We just started about 3 years ago. And we have local chapters in many places. So to conclude, some charities help people thousands of times more than others. Where we give can actually be even more important than whether we give. The difference between that biggest bar and the smallest bar is a lot bigger than the difference between the smallest bar and nothing at all. And that using metrics such as this quality-adjusted life year can allow us to make comparisons between quite different things, which can allow us to see the magnitude of the differences which are there, even if that measure might be off by a little bit. Maybe we don't know exactly how bad it is to be blind, with some uncertainty about that. It's not going to be a factor of 1,000 that we're off by, but that's how big these differences can be. And so using these things, we can have hundreds of times more impact. So if you want to know more about our particular recommendations, then you can go to our website, givingwhatwecan.org, or you can email us, and also just talk to me after these talks in the reception. And I'm very happy to take you through a few examples and to give you some information about a particularly promising organization or giving opportunity that we've just recently found. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Toby. I have the privilege of being able to ask each speaker one quick question before they leave the stage. Toby, what about innovation? Where is there room in your model for people to try out new answers to intractable problems?
Well, that's a great question. And that's something where there is actually a fantastic use of this same metric, the quality adjusted life year, in something called the global burden of disease, which looks at how much illness or how much ill health is caused by many different diseases. Now, it's difficult to use that directly, but Bill Gates has been a big consumer of that information because he's looked at how much ill health is caused by malaria versus tuberculosis and other things, and he's using that in order to work out how good it would be if a malaria vaccine were developed. So that then he can say, well, if a malaria vaccine were developed, it would create a new kind of bar on that graph, which would be very effective, and we'd be able to use that intervention many, many times to help the many millions of people suffering from it. And so ultimately, you think of innovation as creating new interventions there. It's difficult to know how effective that will be because you need to find out the track record of people of creating new successful stories. But it's definitely something that is great. And if people do innovate, then those of us who are using this type of information can benefit from it and start funding that new thing.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks.